We are good to go.
All right.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to another Fundraising Friday. This week, we'll be going over impact-driven storytelling. Very excited to expand on this topic. We went over a storytelling topic a couple weeks ago, and so this is going to be like an even deeper dive on that. This is the now fully staffed Progressive Multiplier team. If you've been on some of the previous calls, we had some placeholder items, but our colleagues Valeria and Lucas, who is on the call now, are now officially members of the team. So welcome, y'all. You'll see them and other members of the Progressive Multiplier team, like my colleague Polly, who is here during these calls. And a little bit about our organization. Progressive Multiplier helps orgs build a progressive movement of, by, and for everyday people. And we do this by organizing and leveraging funding to create on-ramps for progressive organizations to start, strengthen, or scale individual giving and earn revenue programs. And through both an online community of practice and our grant making and support systems, we build the progressive sector's revenue generation knowledge and skills so that it can amplify a people-powered movement. These are our three focus areas of orgs that we fund and send grants to: achieving justice, realizing democracy, and restoring the environment. We believe that through supporting revenue generation practices in these three sectors, this will be the most efficient path to building the people power we need to see the systemic change that we want to. And a quick shout out to our partners at Resilience Initiative who are supporting Fundraising Fridays. If you haven't gotten a chance to introduce yourself in the chat, please do. As Polly said, this session and all previous sessions are recorded and they are going to be put on our private YouTube channel. So if you ever need to refer back to a session, share it with team members, et cetera, you can. I just popped that link in the chat. And so what's also available on top of Fundraising Fridays for this partnership, you have access to these sessions, which are in the new format this year, a dual track, the one-on-one sessions, which are building on our fundamentals, and 201, which is focusing on current trends and next level topics. And on top of the Fundraising Friday sessions, you get one-on-one coaching. So up to 5 hours of individual coaching on particular topics, things that are relevant to you and your organization. If you want to do a deeper dive on one of these subjects that we're covering on a call, or something that's more relevant to like what situation you're in, we're very happy to do that. I'm going to put the link in the chat for the one-on-one signups, and you can either reach out to Michelle Mengel at Resilience Initiative or Polly or myself if you have any questions about scheduling or setting up any of these sessions. Please do set up these sessions. We're here for your benefit and to support yourself in your work. So please feel free to utilize everything that Resilience Initiative and Progressive Multiplier are putting together for y'all. And as I said before, if you need to revisit any of the past sessions, if this is your first one and you want to know what we've covered, not only this year, but in previous years, all of our previous sessions are on our private YouTube channel in the link that I shared in the chat. Great. So we're talking about impact-driven storytelling today, and here are our subject topics. We're going to talk about why stories matter, how you make waves with your stories, trends and influences that we're seeing in storytelling, how to bridge the gap between your org and the stories you want to tell, and then open up some space at the end for some Q&A. Great. So starting with why stories matter, why storytelling is critical to your success pragmatically and financially. Great. So we're going to talk about storytelling, how it comes to be, why it matters for you in your work. If you're a part of the previous storytelling, this might look semi-familiar for you, but for folks who are just joining for this session, wanted to really lay the groundwork of why in fundraising, storytelling is such an important tool. So over the past few years, especially post 2016, post 2020, our industry has been dealing with reckonings around racial justice, and who is centered in stories, and how our industry has been complicit in support in uplifting some of the negative stereotypes and systemic oppression that we are actually trying to dismantle with our work. And so this is not only a conversation that's being had on a micro level at specific organizations, but also on a macro level or industry-wide. And so if this is something that your organization maybe hasn't broached in the past, it definitely is something that you should think about taking to your organization as a method of thinking through how you've engaged with storytelling and what that means, and who it relates to and for. And storytelling matters because at the end of the day, we are serving and uplifting humanity and actual people, right? Our work and the things that we do go beyond the metrics that we write in grant reports and go beyond, just pure numbers. Like, these are human lives that often we're affecting. And so we should be able to uplift those to support the metrics and the numbers that we often put forward. And then also the frame of reference. The subject of the story is not us, even though we're often writing about our work and what we do in efforts to either support our organization or bring light to the issues that we're working on. At the end of the day, we're not supposed to be centering ourselves, our organization, and our work. We're there to uplift and support the communities that we serve. And those are the folks who should be the primary focus of our stories. The stories should be told through their voices and their lived experiences, not necessarily ours. So just wanted to open up. Feel free to come off mute and we can answer questions out loud or in the chat. But thinking deeply about how you do your fundraising, how you do your marketing, your communications, who do you genuinely center in your storytelling currently? And if you feel like you center yourself or your own organization, maybe teasing out why that may be and what the history behind that is for you and your org.
Yeah, I can go. I'm Catherine, and I introduced myself in the chat. Well, first off, I just want to say thank you to you both for organizing and facilitating the session. Yeah, and I work for ActionAid. We're a locally led international human rights organization. So I know that sounds sort of like an oxymoron, but our theory of change is that the people who are experiencing poverty and injustice are the people with the solutions. And so we're trying to connect them to people whose decisions affect their daily lives. So governments, we try to bring their voices into halls of power. And when we've been on a journey with our storytelling. I just joined the organization in November, but we're trying to really include and focus center stories with the community activists and leaders who are a part of the communities that we partner with to implement the work that we do. It's sort of, I think that the thing that we struggle with is just trying to sort of contextualize these stories. We work in a lot of different issue areas, from land rights to women's rights to, to food security, to food and agriculture. And so it's just sort of, we're trying to kind of figure out what's that common thread that brings us all together, or brings our work together. And how do we keep that consistent across our communications while at the same time really centering our comms around stories of change, and inspirational stories of the folks that are really living these experiences and voicing their experiences, and trying to keep our voices out of it.
Great. Thank you for sharing, Catherine. I think that that's, you know, um, a perfect framework of like why storytelling is important, how you interact with the communities that you're serving, where you're amplifying their voices and hoping that they can be heard and enacting change like in tandem with them, not for them, and that framework is super important to emphasize throughout your storytelling journey. And I hope this session will be useful for you all, and there are things that you can take from this. And then also, we'll have the Q&A session at the end. So if there are very specific things that you want to dive deep on, we'll have time to do that. Anyone else feel like sharing about their storytelling journey?
I can. Oh, I work at the Natural History Museum, and we provide a lot of free services, educational programming, community science programming. Kind of get out to nature, experience nature. Kind of that whole encouraging people to have an additional outlet and be outside and enjoy nature. And while our programs are very successful and we do focus on, this is kind of a K through gray educational experience, and we have programming for young kids and middle school and high school kids and all the way up through adult. We've got tons of volunteers and great adult community science programs. But I think what we maybe struggle with is just how do you, certain people just have kind of maybe a misconception about museums and what museums, who museums serve, and maybe this more of an elitist type mentality. And that is certainly not our, museum. We're a small community museum, but we are stuck way out on a peninsula in California, and access is sometimes hard. So we, do a lot of scholarships. We do a lot of free busing and field trips to get kids to school. So it's very successful, but it's just, I think it could be much more. And that's what we're struggling with, is how to get, the community really behind us.
Yeah, for sure. I totally get that. And, I think it's slightly different because you're not like quote unquote a direct service organization with like a hard constituency that you can point to. But I think based on what you're saying, sourcing potentially real life stories from the young people who get to experience your museum and what it like meant to them is a great way to be able to uplift those stories from essentially who are your constituency, even though it's not a very like solid focus area group. I think that starting there and being able to uplift those stories could be a great way for you to explore more inclusive and more uplifting storytelling and create a different voice to push back against that stereotype that you're facing about who museums are for. Great. I think we have Danielle and then Brittany on stack.
I work at Justice Outside, and we actually have spent this whole year really focusing on impactful storytelling and also ethical storytelling. And one of the things that we've noticed, especially in our fundraising and like with our board, is a lot of times they want to tell other people's stories. And so we've been like trying really hard to like get them to kind of tell their own story as to why they're really passionate about this work, and not like co-op the stories of our community, and being like very intentional about, if we're going to share a story from members of our community, making sure we get permission from them, making sure that they're, part of that story, or the ones telling the story and we're not the ones telling their story. And so that's been, kind of part of the learning journey for our board and for some of our donors this year, but it's something that we're really trying really hard to implement, across the board in our organization.
Great,
And
thank you.
you guys really utilize social media quite a bit, and I think that's a really I know we're going to get into a whole bunch of stuff, but that's a really good way to amplify the stories that do get told, whether it's like the board member's voice or the people who are using the services voice. You guys are doing a nice, good surround sound on that.
Great. And before we go to Brittany, I just wanted to uplift Danielle. We our previous storytelling session was actually on like ethical sourcing and telling of stories. So please feel free to check out the YouTube channel. We have another session on that if you didn't get to join the previous one that potentially would be helpful for that. We'll have the slide decks as well to be able to share with you. Brittany?
Yeah, so hi guys. Today's actually my first day with the Children's Coalition here in Northeast Louisiana. So I'm really excited to be able to implement storytelling into my role here. But my background is in media and advertising. And so we use storytelling a lot in that, in that industry, it's more or less usually called testimonial in a way. But we're even with like having a news and a weather product inside a TV station and doing digital marketing, this, it's always about, for me, with storytelling is you want to hear from the person that it actually affected, that actually walked away with, something from the experience, whether it was, a business owner, from my past experience, maybe it was a business owner that said, how something panned out for them. Maybe it was, they tie a little emotion into it. We know that invoking emotion is really kind of what gets people's attention, and that will resonate with them. And then another really point that we did with storytelling in news and media was with weather. Northeast Louisiana is a crazy weather place. I personally lost my home due to a tree falling on it during a hurricane. But when you have, and so personal storytelling, is very effective. But when you are able to say, this is what happened to me, and if it wasn't for, this organization or this group, and, leaving me feeling safe or informed, or, I think that the person most affected, which is driving home the subject is not us, but, the person most affected by the experiences that's the story you want to tell. That's the most impactful to me. So I'm looking forward to, implementing that over into a nonprofit and development structure. To me, it's the same, how you do it. It's just the content.
Definitely. Thank you for that, Brittany. Yeah, let's go to the next slide, Paul. Great. So storytelling helps not only share stories out, but build trust within a community. So not only are you going to be, through effective storytelling, seen as an expert from folks who are outside of that community, that you're a person or a group that can be trusted to find out information. You're going to be seen as a valuable ally inside that community for being able to like uplift stories, especially if you're working with a marginalized community, being able to take those stories and share them with folks who haven't heard them or don't have the access to hear them. So we can think about this internally, but just wanted to get you all thinking about how storytelling can help advance your work in community building. And that can be from whether you're a direct service organization, whether you're an advocacy and organizing organization, or whether you work in the arts. Your community are the folks who either support your organization or participate with you. So think deeply about how your storytelling affects your relationship with these folks, and how more effective or more inclusive storytelling can help really strengthen that relationship between your organization and the community that you're working with. And you know, one of my favorite quotes: "With great power comes great responsibility." You know, being entrusted to tell someone's story is an opportunity, you know, to really push back against narratives that exist out in culture, to be able to uplift things that haven't been heard before, and to change people's minds and change people's lives. But the opposite of that can happen as well, whether intentionally or unintentionally. You can reinforce negative stereotypes. You can, you know, push deeper in things that we're trying to actually reverse with our work. So we have to be conscious, but also be really effective in how we tell our stories. And I added a reference here that I would love for you all to check out. I'm going to put the link in the chat. This is the United Nations World Food Program Style Guide. They did an article talking about why they actually changed how they've written in the past, what changes they implemented. And I think what's best about this style guide is the explanation for each change of like how they wrote in the past and how that removed agency from the folks that they were serving. So it gives you like a real example of like, you know, conscious or unconscious bias, affirming or reaffirming things that may be negative, even though that's not intentional choice, and what they did to like really be intentional about pushing back against that. So I think it's a great resource. Feel free to check that out. I think that there are some tools that are more general that each organization can use no matter where you're working, and what your stories you're telling. But I think even some of the more nuanced storytelling, there are good examples in there that you can probably relate to your own work, and just things to keep in mind as far as how to tell stories effectively, and how to write with dignity and uplift the people that we're serving. Great. So now that we talked about how we told stories, let's talk about how we show and measure and capture impact. So there are three different types of metrics. You know, I think all of us who worked on fundraising, who work in development, very familiar with the thought of metrics from like grant reports or having to share with folks how many people you're serving, what you're doing. But there are actually different tiers to those numbers, right? And what they tell are actually different stories. So oftentimes those things that we're talking about, you know, as far as how many people you're serving, what you're actually doing, are lower level metrics that don't get to like really the root and the true vision of the organization that you work for. So those metrics are often either capacity or activity metrics. So capacity metrics are really tactic and task related goals. And these show your organization's ability to like get things done. So how efficient you are, whether that is you know, how many sessions you've held, how many actions you've held, how many exhibits your museum put on, right? That's just showing like a scale of, you know, this is how much work we're able to put out, right? And we often stop at these numbers, but don't really go deeper about where we are, who we are, and why we're doing the work that we're doing. So these metrics can actually be leveled up to show deeper impact. The next tier are your activity metrics. So these are program and strategy related goals. So what we're measuring here is progress towards the work of the organization. So your actual impact, right? These might be the amount of people served, the percentage of, you know, if you're working with food insecurity or poverty, like a percentage difference before within the time period, for instance, like, so saying, you know, you reduced food insecurity in a community by 15% over the last 5 years, or increased the college acceptance rate for a school district and by 20%, right? These are like more impactful. So you can show like because of the steps that we've taken, the tactics and tasks that we've done, these were like the direct results of them. And so these go a little bit deeper, but there's also like a huge portion of metrics that we often don't share and don't talk about, but are directly related to our work. And so these are impact metrics. This is related to the mission and vision of your organization and shows, you know, long-term progress towards the world that we want to create. So these are world building metrics, and these are ones that are often like the most impactful. And this is where storytelling can really be helpful to back up impact metrics. Metrics at this tier, we're talking about, so now that we've described what we did, and the direct effect of what we did, right? Where does that leave us in our grander vision of the world that we're trying to create? Every nonprofit has a mission and a vision, you know, and your vision statement should be an ideal situation where your organization should no longer exist, right? These are the conditions where, like, for instance, at Progressive Multiplier, if all progressive organizations had the resourcing and money that they needed to be able to win all of their campaigns, then there would be no more need for Progressive Multiplier. So what we did worked, and we can cease to exist, right? And that's what we're working towards. And so what we want to be able to show in these impact metrics is how we're actually moving the needle and getting closer to a world where that exists. And we'll go a little bit deeper on how to find those and what that means. So we almost have to like start backwards. We're going to start big and go small. So our organizational North Star defines our impact metrics. So thinking through where you want your organization to be in the next 3 to 5 years, right? That's the world that you're actually creating, right? These are the environments that you're going to create. And then your work is going to actually get you there. Your work is the vehicle that's going to create this environment. So thinking through who you want to be, who you want to serve, why you want to serve these folks, and why at this scale, and why with this type of work, and what is the impact in your community of that work, right? And then that's the world that you're creating. That's your organizational North Star. And those measurements and those goals and benchmarks will be your impact measures and how close you are to building something like that, right? And then when we take it down another level, getting a little bit more into the weeds, now we're talking about, okay, so how are we actually going to do that? If we want to, you know, let's stay with like maybe a food insecurity situation. If we want to, in New York City, make it that everybody in New York City, right, has access, at least access to clean, healthy food, right? What are we actually going to do to make that world actually feasible, right? So we'll need to run XYZ programs, and they'll need to be in XYZ areas so there's equal distribution, right? So now you're getting into your strategy of like how we want to create this world. So you're thinking, what programs are you going to run? Why do you need to create these programs, and who is going to be running that, and how many folks they'll serve to make that an actual reality? And then when we go deeper down, and then these are like the base level metrics, right? Now, to ensure that just because you build something doesn't mean that it's actually successful, right? So now what are the tasks that we're going to do to define what success in each of these programs look like, so that we know we're doing the right thing, right? So what are the actual steps that we're going to take? How deep and wide do these programs need to be? And what does the successful programming and implementation looks like? And that's how you would define your success for each of your programs, which leads back up to that larger vision and that story of, this is the work that we're doing to create this world, and this is why this world is important, right? And then to tell a story, you need information. So how do we get all of this information? There are 4 steps. So data design, which is what we're doing now. What information is important? How am I asking the right questions? Then it's data collection. How am I getting this information based off of, you know, your programming? Where do you get it from? Who are you asking on your team for this or in the community? Data storage, where do you put this information? So you have access to it when you need it. And data analysis, how do I use this information? And so what storytelling actually is data analysis. We have all this empirical data, this anecdotal data. We're going to compile it, talk about the trends that we're seeing, and then share that with the world. And so what we're focusing on is the data analysis portion of it. Any questions on the metrics? I know that it can be a little wonky and theoretical, so I want to make sure that everybody grasps it or knows how that relates to their work. We all good? All right, I'm seeing some thumbs up. I think we can keep going, Paul. All right, cool. So let's talk about trends and influence and like what stories you should actually be telling. We saw on the first slide that we're in a moment of like real reckoning with storytelling. And so all stories actually aren't the same, and what you're trying to share isn't the same. We believe there's 5 main types of stories that organizations tell. The first one is like founding stories. We're very familiar with those. If you've ever written a grant that's like, tell me your organizational history, your organizational description, that's a founding story. So what we really want to convey in these stories is what was going on in the world that drove the founders to say, we need to do something about this, right? So what existed before? What was the impetus to create this organization? So frame the environment that birthed the organization and frame how your organization is actually a direct solution to that problem, right? We're here to fix things. So what got so bad that someone wanted to fix it, and why are we prime to fix that, right? Those are your founding stories. That's what you kind of want to get over in those. And then we have what we're calling struggle stories, right? So these stories are often about growing pains. Struggle stories are like, maybe you're going through a fundraising gap, or you had some programming fall through, or you had to shift programming, other forms of difficulty, right? The framework that we want to use for this type of storytelling is showing how valuable our organization is in spite of the current difficulties that we're facing, and that we're worth investing in. And this term investment is not just financially. We're talking, these are stories that you can share with your community about, this is why you should still believe in us. This is why you should still show up. This is why we're still doing the work to support you, and be invested in the success of our work to help uplift this community, right? That's often something that has to be shared. Obviously not the funnest story to tell, but these are part of those conversations and how to frame that and have that. And your struggle stories should hopefully lead into what we call a phoenix story. So these are stories of perseverance, rising from the ashes, right? Your organization has gone through the tough times and you've emerged victorious. This is a space to really share your accomplishments, show your organization's grit and determination, and prove that the original investment is worth it. But we're going to do that again in the framework of the community that we're serving, right? So this is why it's important that we exist to help help uplift this in the community, right? What would happen, in a different circumstance, if our organization wasn't around, to be able to share this work, to be able to uplift this community, and what the reason for us existing are, and what the positives are for the community, and how we can continue to engage and uplift them through our existence. The next is an apology story. These stories are, very difficult to tell. They come from when we mess up, which is going to happen, regardless of who you are, where you are. And I think that these stories are some of the ones that you have to hold with the most care. And so acknowledging a shortcoming with honesty and humility is incredibly important. and with a firm acknowledgement of your shortcomings and a naming of the harm that was caused. Oftentimes, we'll see apologies in the public that are really PR driven. You can tell that this has been edited by 17 people and run through a legal firm, to make sure that there's no culpability or liability, right? But those often come off as cruel and insensitive, right? If you're going to apologize, it's important to name the harm that was caused. In a previous session that we did, our ethical storytelling one, we have a video that we shared from Polly. Was it from the United Nations?
It was
No, it was
Doctors Without Borders.
Doctors Without Borders. That's what it was. About how they advertised and fundraised in the past, and how they reinforced negative stereotypes about non-white people through their fundraising, right? And what was very apparent about that video, and we can also find the link and share it with you all. I think it's a pretty interesting watch, especially around a very honest and frank apology story. Is they weren't afraid to name why they messed up. And I think that even though, they're going to mess up again in the future, we're all people, we're not perfect. There are going to be snafus and things that happen. But the fact that they were able to like outrightly name and not run from the fact of like, I'm not apologizing because someone told me this was messed up. We realized what we did was messed up, and this is how we're actually going to rectify it, right? So laying everything, all the cards out on the table, I think is a very strong example of a good apology story, at least the framework of a good one.
There's another one that I really like, which came from I grew up in Baltimore, and the Baltimore Sun about maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, put out a very big article that about they were apologizing to the city, to the citizens, about their racist framing of news stories historically, and they did everything that you should do, just like the Doctors Without Borders one was, which was like, they admitted what they did. They showed examples of what they did wrong to prove that they understand that this wasn't a fake apology, but like, these are ways that this is an example of how we, made Black folks the villains and white folks the heroes, and and just really sort of owned it. I was proud to say that I knew the publisher, the editor, because we grew up together. So I was very proud of him when I saw this go out. But it was like a very big, you could look it up. It was a very big story, a very like, here are our offenses that we are owning, and these are the things. And then they listed all the things that they're going to do to try to rectify it. I think that Doctors Without Borders did the same thing, where they were like, these are the ways that we told stories that was really shitty in the past, because it was manipulative, and we wanted to, we knew that this narrative was going to help us raise more money. And we now have, come to a different place on that. And this is where I think that we should all be coming from, but we think the value of what's actually going on is more important than if we can make 10 cents off of it or 5 cents off of it. That the people's stories and what truly happened should be first. And so there aren't a lot. I don't see a lot of places that do this really well, but I think those two were good examples in my book.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and the final type of story is what we're calling a final victory story. So this goes back to the world building metrics that we were talking about before. So this can be, after a big organizational win, after, if you're working in organizing or anything, like a bill got passed, or a big benchmark for like a community that you're serving, or even if it's a museum, like an expansion of the museum or new programming, anything like that. This type of story is to show this is going to create the conditions that we want to see in the world and why that is, right? So we really want to lean into like future facing language, what this is going to mean for like the community that we're serving, how they're going to be able to use this tool to better either self-advocate or if it's like a public good, just enjoy a public good to create a better community, a safer community, a more interesting community, whatever the case is. But what we want to do is tie our big win to a larger vision of a world that we're trying to build. Any questions about the 5 types of stories, or like how your organization may particularly interact with any of these styles? You're not going to use all of them all the time, but these are generally like the types that exist, and like the strategies that you would want to use in those scenarios.
I have a quick question. I don't know if there's a direct answer to this, but like we're starting to think about our end of the year campaign. And I guess this, depends on what the organization is, but do you see one type of story kind of mobilizing or like being more appropriate for an end of the year campaign? Or would you recommend just like a mix of the stories, or what's sort of your advice or experience with that?
Yeah, for sure. So from a fundraising perspective, I think it really just depends on the organizational state, like where you are and what the impetus you want to share with folks are to give, right? So there's like, I think, positive stories, and then there's I don't want to say negative, but like, let's say non-positive stories, right? So say you're having like a really good year, you might want to lean into a final victory story. Like, what was some awesome programming that you ran? How did that get you closer to the world that you want to build, and why you should continue to donate? Because this is the amazing work that we're doing, and this is what we're going to do next year to build on top of that to get even closer, right? Or if you had a rough year and you're coming out of it, that would be maybe like a Phoenix story framed end of year campaign. First start of the year was rough. We faced budget cuts, or like, our giving was down, but the org really pulled together. The community really supported us through this hard times, just the way that we support them. And now we're here, and we're here for the long haul, and this is what we're going to be doing in the future, right? Or if it's a tough fundraising year, it could be a struggle story, but you can frame a struggle story in like a positive light, right? And some of this is just about being frank with who you are, and again, telling honest stories. I think in fundraising, a lot of us are just like, our org is great no matter what's going on, our programming is amazing no matter what's going on, right? We all know, like from being on the inside, things like orgs have ebbs and flows. There's moments of dysfunction, right? I'm not saying you should air your dirty laundry, but there's a framing and a way to be able to say, this has been a hard year for us, but we should exist, and this is why you should invest in this organization, because this is what we're going to do to put it right. And I think that oftentimes, we don't ask. We don't ask in times of crisis, whether it's through pride or through image or ego or whatever the case is. But as the adage goes, a closed mouth doesn't get fed. So if you don't frame around your needs from a fundraising standpoint, even if it is like a struggle story year, I think that you can be doing your org a disservice, because you're not giving your donors a chance to really lean in the moment, and feel like they're supporting an organization that they truly believe in, to the organization's needs. I hope that semi answered your question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, great.
I
Any
do,
other?
I do
Oh,
think
yeah.
it can be sometimes difficult to like, what story you need to tell in the moment based on whatever's going on, but it can feel sometimes a little difficult to then, how do I pivot to the ask, or how do I pivot to the right ask at this time? So an example is when you're doing your end of the year fundraising, let's say you're in the Giving Tuesday stage of your end of the year fundraising. Well, we know that that is a time of the year or a fundraising period that's really good for acquisition, peer-to-peer, getting a lot, and those conversions of people who've been on your file and active but not given. So I know that there can be those moments of like, and I want to put my best face forward. So how, but I need to tell this other story right now. How do I get from like, we're struggling, or we did this thing, or, or, whatever, to the ask that's appropriate for the moment. So I think there's a bit of art and science that's related to this. Like, when you have a series of narratives happening at the same time, like you have this one, let's say you have an apology story to tell, but you also are promoting a specific campaign, or or it's Giving Tuesday, or it's end of the year. And how do you manage that you have this one mega narrative happening that feels incongruous to the narrative that you also then need to use to do fundraising? That can be a really frustrating time, but I would definitely say that is an opportunity for you to sort of like lean, I don't know how else to say it, but to like lean into authenticity, like, it's okay to be like, we fucked up and we're trying to do better and we need your help to do better. you can still turn even difficult conversations into like, support us, because I do think that there is something valuable in owning your, like, even in an apology situation, owning your shit and saying, I'm going to try to do better and move on. I mean, that's, and again, the Doctors Without Borders did that too. Like, they were like, that whole video was an apology video, and at the end they were like, and I hope you still stick with us, and I hope you still give. So when you get in those moments where you're like, I can't, we have this other thing, we have to stop fundraising right now because of this thing, then your need doesn't change. Your need to pay people salaries does not change. To do the work does not change. You can't stop the calendar. So what you have to do is become nimble at that pivot, and lean on your people. Like, you might be stuck. So ask somebody in your organization to help you unstick. How would you do this? And they don't even have to be in comms or development. Somebody you think has got a good brain. Get some advice to break yourself out of the box.
I think that's great advice, Polly, because I think oftentimes we like frame our work around like how we would read it as like a person who like creates it, right? But if you're doing just a donor letter to a regular donor, like, they're not a development professional, or probably don't work in comms, right? They just like your org and support your work, right? So if you ask someone outside of the department, like, hey, how does this read? Does this come off authentic, right? Oftentimes, like, we're trying to, I think we talked about before, like, create emotion or try and like dictate and guide how like a letter comes off, but sometimes we get it wrong, right? And so it's often good to check with folks who don't have our perspective, just to get an outside voice of like, hey, no, this comes off cold, or this might be a little bit too much, or you know what I mean? So I think that that's really good advice, Paul.
I just wanted to add what you were just saying, because grant writing is, for a small organization like ours, is, it is a collaborative effort. And because a lot of our work that we do is science related and somewhat technical related, in my mind, as the storyteller and the grant writer, I keep trying to go back to the team and saying, okay, you gotta tone this down. It's confusing. Remember, you're selling a story, right? So we just had something really recently where we had written a grant to a foundation, and with a very specific angle, and then we were taking the same request to then pitch it out to the community. And I kept explaining, I said, you can't just hit send. This is a total rewrite now, because it was it's very technical for the foundation, and that would work. But now when you're trying to pitch it as just a community project that's going to help everybody, you have to rewrite the whole thing. And it was a real struggle to go through that process. And I think same thing, we had like 10 iterations, and by the, and then we kept pushing up against the deadline of when this was actually due. And it was a little frustrating for me, because, at one point I just kind of said, okay, it's time out. We're no more iterations. I have to hit the send button. And I would say, I don't think I was 100% pleased with the outcome, and we'll see now. But I don't know if you have any advice on, you know, how do you work with your colleagues when they don't understand marketing and storytelling, and you're trying to get them to totally shift their thinking. It's hard.
I've had this experience 10,000 times in my career. You know, like when anything is scientific and you're working with folks that are scientists or that type of language, attorneys are the ones that I've probably had the most experience with, and the number of arguments that I've had about, like, I understand that the precisely correct terminology is this, but no one freaking understands what those words mean in a sentence beyond attorneys, and only specific types of attorneys even know what you're talking about. So we can't have this language being public. So like what I try to do in those situations is I really try to remove personality out of it, and I try to even remove me as the expert sometimes. And I'll do like Microsoft, Google, all of those have readability meters on their on doc that you can run something through. And there's also very public information about like why it matters to read at a fifth grade level, to write in a fifth grade level, not because you want to dumb it down, but because most people skim. There's a lot of people with disabilities. I have ADHD and dyslexia, so I read slower. So I can use big words, but when I'm reading something quickly, the more accessible language, the more I'm going to pick it up anyway. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll share some info like, hey, knowing that, best practices, and sometimes that Latin language will work with them, is that we should be doing writing in a fifth grade level hyperlink. We should, I ran this text through our readability study, and this was coming out at an 11th grade level. We need to we have to really bring the accessibility up on this. So I switch the language. I don't say we need to bring down the level. We need to bring accessibility up, and sort of show our value for this is my value, but hopefully our values of like, it's not just that this will help us in comms. It's not just that this will help us in communication, but this is what we should be doing because it's more accessible. And so I try to reframe, pull myself out as a little bit of the expert, and put maybe it's a little passive aggressive, I don't know, but put when it's useful, the accessibility argument, or whatever's the right frame that will get them out of their head about it. And sometimes also the conversation could be about audience. Like, the way that you wrote this is for this audience. Our database does not represent that group of people. Our database is 1% those people. So if we only write for 1% of the audience, we're not going to hit most of our people. So we need to, up the accessibility of this and make it more broad. Those are little tricks of my trade. Does anybody else have like things that they've done in those situations to help you get something worded right?
One thing I would suggest is look for any jargon or terms and take that out. Like anything that like in your mind that you maybe necessarily understand, but it's an acronym, it's shorthand for something, or it relates to like some subset that people don't normally engage with in normal conversation. Take that out, or like take the term out and put the definition of the term where you had that word originally. And that increases the readability so much. Oftentimes, because we are experts in our field, and especially as if you're a grant writer, we just take things for a given that folks understand like what our work is and what we do. And I still have to explain to my parents like what I do for a living. I've been doing this since I was 17. They just don't get it, right? So whenever like I have to talk like how's work? I literally have to like think through in my head, like, how would I say this to like Polly, and then remove every word that actually explains like what I like, or how work actually is, and just put my definition in there. And then like, oh, okay, I get that. Like, you know, because we sometimes we just take for granted that folks can like engage with us, because normally who we talk about with our work are folks who are on the same wavelength with us, but we're talking with the outside audience, right? That's why audience matters. Even going through an exercise of like, if there is a term in there that folks are stuck on, ask everybody who's looking at it to define that term. I guarantee you there will be very specific differences in how each of us define that term. So I'm like, if we as experts can't all explain this the same exact way, how do we expect the audience to all read it the same exact way? We can't. So we have to make sure that we can have a common language that folks can understand like our work, and engage with it properly.
So Josephine, I'd love it if you jump in at this and tell us what you're dealing with right now.
Yeah, can you hear me? Sorry, I'm just in a coffee shop, so I'm hoping it's not too echoey. Yeah, I'm currently, my team is we're a very small team. We have a very small communications team. Most of us are based in Indonesia. There's a couple of us based in the US just for fundraising purposes and communication purposes. I joined the team a couple of years ago. Prior to my arrival, it was very focused on just sharing impact, just sharing statistics. I was brought on as part of, because I previously have worked with documentary teams and I worked in policy and with governments members. I was part of my job was to really like humanize our stories and things like this. And we have great stories. We work with great indigenous and like local people in Indonesia, across Indonesia. We have like really rich storytelling. It just doesn't, I just work with a very technical team. It just doesn't very compute often, and a technical team that's really not used to telling stories for an international audience or for a different audience than just like scientists or other technicians. So I'm currently facing something with the senior team in Indonesia. Sorry, I hope it's not too loud. And part of our work is to bring financial inclusion to the conservation space, which is really innovative and very exciting. But the way the team write about it, it just is very, very dry and very report-like. And so my challenge at the moment is to humanize it, bring the people involved in it. It's very difficult. Not getting the stories from the ground, and I go to Indonesia as much as I can, but I'm not there at the moment, and I'm just facing challenges around like getting the team to understand our audience more, and to understand like why they're writing things. They can't. A year ago they wouldn't have even written this, so I'm glad they're coming to me with stories like this. Like they're like, oh, let's put this on the website and let's share this with our donors. And I'm like, it's just so dry, and I don't want to discourage anyone from like writing things and like coming to me with stories, but I'm also like, it is very dry. So I'm just walking that fine line of like, okay, like I'm having to just do a lot of rewrites, do a lot of edits, and it is difficult. But we really for our communication storytelling side, like we've just invested in a new team member, but we're like really at the early stages of like really bringing this to like from community stories, from just very dry data.
Yeah. So one of the ways that I managed this in different organizations was to actually do like a lunch and learn, or if I can make it part of an actual retreat topic, to do like, how do we tell our story organizationally, and break up by departments. And the prompt that I would use often was like, it is bring your favorite nonprofit person to school day for an elementary school for your favorite niece. And you just followed Wonder Woman. And you've got to talk about to this group of elementary school students about the work that you do in a way that will be understandable, but also interesting, following Wonder Woman. Sometimes I'll leave the Wonder Woman out because that, sometimes when I did it, that was like a really good motivator. And once or twice it was like a total depressor, and I was like, okay, Wonder Woman's not there. But like, you put it in the context of like, you're standing in front, like, don't just write it like this isn't about written word, but like, imagine yourself standing in front of a room of fourth graders, and how would you talk about what we do and keep them interested? And the way that they wrote, and I had, I asked folks to like do little performances, so people hammed it up because it was a staff thing, but the exercise itself really did, and multiple times that I did it, bring out a little bit of like the, oh, but you also had the folks who were pushing back, like, but we're not giving this to fourth graders. Like, yeah, you're right, we're not. But if we wrote it for fourth graders, wouldn't everybody that we needed to reach be able to read it and understand what we're doing? So it wound up being really fun, and also sometimes challenging, because people sometimes really struggled for how do we talk about this thing that's really like intense in a way that's more accessible. And then we just sort of like, the folks who really struggled, we all like workshopped it together, and sometimes the great, answer came from someone we wouldn't have even expected, So I really try to, when you can, if you can make it like a community thing where everyone is on the same page, or you're trying to get everyone on the same page together, rather than like pointing to like, Steve, you're always so dense in the stuff that you give me, like, let's just make it a big conversation so Steve doesn't feel so I don't know if that helps. I don't know, Kufili, if you've got ideas
No,
too.
yeah, it does help. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Polly. One thing that you can also do, I don't know how you're necessarily receiving the stories from the ground, like in what format, but sharing actually more of those stories from the ground and less of the organizations like commenting on the story, right? And then framing it just as like, hey, like we talked about before, we want to uplift the stories of the folks that we're serving, right? And that being the framework. So it's less about, how you're like kind of removing the middle person, right? So instead of the story having to go up, be translated and come back down, realistically, your donors probably have more of the same understanding, or would understand the story directly from the person that you're serving, rather than it going up and then back down, right? So cut out that step as much as you can. I think that it also creates a deeper level of authenticity, like we're sharing this directly from a person that we're working with on the ground. And so I think that it could be a win-win. I do think that like creating the storytelling arm of your organization and doing those trainings, right? Like what Polly was saying, can work in tandem with this, right? So that the other portion that your org is like working to support will get better over time still, because you're doing that work and reinforcing it, but like you're also creating space to uplift the folks telling their own stories, right? And then again, that builds trust, because then, it's not doctored, it's not changed or anything. Folks there can actually see like, oh, I did this interview, and like they can share it, also too, of like, this is exactly what you kind of want to see.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing right now. The comms members in Indonesia are really pushing this. I think it was Brittany that mentioned this earlier around like testimonials, and a lot of that work that we're doing in country is more for like visualization or data feedback to communities. So we're getting communities to tell other communities like how it's worked in their stories, and how it's worked in their villages, what's happening, how it's helped their lives and things like that. But it's very like peer-to-peer between communities. So it's getting those stories, which we're only just started to do that as well, like in packaged and like to an international audience as well. And that's what we're starting to do. The one problem I'm facing with that is that I think we need an external person, because sometimes we've gone to communities just maybe with other members of the technical team or other members of the team, and they're very, very positive. But sometimes I feel like they're just telling us what we want to hear, right? They're just like, oh yeah, Planet Indonesia is great, we've been doing this, this and this. But it's like, I'm trying to really pull out that honesty, and like, as you said earlier, like the other types of stories, it's not just like, oh yeah, everything's going perfect. It's like, what were the struggles, what were the challenges, what's happening here? They're like, no, Planet Indonesia is great. Like, keep working with us, like we're doing this. So it's really, we don't consider ourselves like a traditional like charity. We're not just paying for services. It's really a relationship with these communities. For some reason, like when it comes to communications, that's just not there, that level of like honesty, that to really like when they know it's going to be published or like shared. So that's what we're struggling at the moment with that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that that's normal though. It's like an inherent fear, right? Of, potentially if things are going bad, that the support will go away, right? It's the same thing as like, a funder asking in your annual report, all right, so how was the year? Fabulous. Nothing went wrong. 100% to the T, we hit all our metrics, you know what I mean? Meanwhile, like you're putting out fires left and right, but it's all good. You got there in the end, right? But that innate fear of like something may be taken away if I told the truth, like exists, down the line as well. And so I think part of that, we talked about before about like how we're gathering our metrics, right? And so an important part of that is what are the questions that you're actually asking folks, and how to like tease out that information, right? So oftentimes if I'm consulting with someone and I'm not getting the answers that I want, or like they're not answering my question, it's because I'm asking the wrong question, right? So think deeply about like how you're framing things to be able to get the information that you want. And then again, it's just a matter of building trust. Once they see like there's no negative repercussions from being real about what's going on, then they're going to be more likely to open up in the future, and that'll establish like a deeper relationship.
Anybody else have anything, or should we keep it moving? All right.
Great. So let's talk about implementation, and how we get to what we want to get to. When we want to share our stories, right? The first part is we actually talked about a lot of this stuff just now. First is understanding our audience. Different narratives are going to resonate with different audiences. So being able to say, this is for donors, this is for volunteers, this is for beneficiaries, this is for the general public, right? Then you can identify how your story needs to be shared with those folks based on their interests, their values, their emotions, and how they interact with your organization as well. What is important for them and what isn't important for them? What's super pertinent information, what's not super pertinent information. And we want to gather authentic stories, right? So engaging with the community directly, and individuals who have been directly impacted by our work. These are authentic testimonials. These can't be faked or doctored. This is like the good stuff. This is the gold. So we want to conduct these interviews, be able to engage in dialogue with them, and help these personal narratives really reinforce the story that we are telling, right? So these are facts, right? This is factual data backing up what we're saying. I can say, Progressive Multiplier, is an awesome organization, and we help all these orgs, and their lives are changed from taking one of my trainings, right? That's just me huffing and puffing. But if I get Danielle to write a testimonial like, oh, I came to this fundraising Friday and it completely changed how I viewed storytelling, and I'm so grateful for like those sessions, and I recommend anybody do that. That's validation, right? That's facts backing up what we're doing. So, we want to be able to point to that because that's from the source of like they've been through something and saw positive benefit from it, right? And then we want to prioritize that emotional connection. I think we talked about that before. Someone brought it up in the conversation. Being able to forge emotional connection between the target of who we're writing to, and our organization and the folks that we're serving, right? And it's not just one organization that we want to, or one emotion that we want to solicit, right? It can be empathy, it could be passion, it could be righteous anger, like, oh my God, this is insane. I want to do something about this right now, right? Each one of those tactics require a different writing style, different facts being presented, different framing, right? But what we want to do is we want those emotions to lead towards an action, right? So maybe we want to write a certain way if we want to steer someone towards donating to our organization. If we're, you know, we write a certain way because we want folks to show up and volunteer, or we want to make people so damn mad they show up at our action and our rally next week, right? Those are 3 different types of writing and writing styles that are supposed to create a different type of call to action internally for the reader. And what we want to do is draw a line between the work that we're doing and the call to action, and then that person being able to follow through on that. When we're writing to someone, we're telling them something and we want them to do something with that information, right? And so we have to be knowledgeable about what we're actually asking people to do, because that influences how we are going to write and communicate with them. All right. Show, don't just tell. Visual aids are super helpful. This also increases the accessibility and backing of the story, right? If we're sharing something and it's 7 pages of prose, like people read that even like, oh yeah, no, I'm not doing that today. I had 20 minutes to just browse through my emails, right? But if there's pictures attached that grab the eye, if there's videos that people can click on and get, you know, information in short bite-sized portions, especially now, and with younger generations. You know, that's why things like TikTok and before it Vine are so popular. You can get so much information regardless of whether it's a funny video or something informational in a short bite-sized amount of time, and they can absorb it and there's a call to action after it, right? Or even infographics to back up. I know we were talking about earlier, like scientific things, or a policy, you know what I mean? And instead of explaining what housing policy or what some scientific thing is doing to the environment through words, being able to say, you know, in 1980 it was this hot, in 2023 it's this hot, climate change is real, right? That helps people understand at a visual level and brings the accessibility up, right? So anytime you can use a tool, it's very useful. The one thing that I would be sure about is when you're using imagery, ensure and double check that you're using empowering imagery and avoiding stereotypes, especially when you're working with marginalized communities, because we don't want to reinforce savior complexes, or that we're there as like, you know, the liberators of certain people, or they need us to help them do anything, right? We're working in tandem and actually in support of folks. So use imagery that helps carry that narrative rather than negative narratives that reinforce stereotypes. Next is structure. You know, well-structured stories, whether it is a children's book to, you know, the Iliad, have a beginning, middle, and end. You know, you're setting the scene, you're talking about the environment, like whether it's like a founder story, what is the challenge? Why are we here? What's going on? You're introducing the protagonist, who is, you know, your community and your organization in support in tandem with them. And then we're uplifting what the resolution is going to be, right? This narrative arc has not changed in hundreds of thousands of years. It is a time-tested tradition passed down beyond culture, beyond, you know, type of people. This is just how humans communicate in the most effective way to share information. So, you know, it's not broken. We should continue to do that. Lean into this structure. And we talked about authenticity a lot today. Ensure that you remain transparent and genuine, whether it's in a positive light or in a non-positive light. Discuss the hurdles that your organization is facing with authenticity. This shows accountability, vulnerability with the community, and it gives people the chance to really like empathize. And the call to action from authenticity and being real is that you're inviting people to join you in struggle and help to uplift yourself in your work, right? And that creates solidarity between yourself and your target audience. So ensure that you keep framing things in real ways. Again, incorporate data. Personal narratives are very powerful. People love numbers to be able to spout that off as backing up for it. So any quantifiable results provides that evidence that helps people again, have that authenticity, or helps people visualize like the impact of what you're doing. We had an example of this. We had a call, a fundraising Friday call, probably when I first started, and someone was struggling with like sharing the impact of their work because they worked in like LA County, and their org like got, I think, 30,000 kids free lunch. But Los Angeles is like 7 million people in the city. 30,000 people doesn't seem that impressive. And so, what I told them was like, reframe it. Like 30,000 people would be the entirety of Staples Center where the Lakers play, plus 6,000 people outside. That's how many kids you got fed, right? That visual of data and combined with storytelling helps create an impact, whereas 30,000 seemed negligible before. For people, especially in that like area who are familiar with that arena, that's like a huge visual cue to be like, oh, wow, you're doing amazing work, right? So it's how you tell and convey things that really shows, how impactful you are. So lean into that. If you know your target audience, whether it's like a location, a specific demographic, using things that they can relate to understand deeper theoretical things that may be harder is a great way to help break down that barrier for accessibility and create deeper understanding. We talked about this earlier, but encourage participation, right? So your story should end with an implicit, but also an explicit call to action, right? So join us, do this thing, show up here, give us money, write a friend, call a neighbor, right? What you want folks to do is to be able to take this information and share it, but share it in the ways that you want it shared, right? And so what you're doing too is taking people from active listener or passive listener to an active participant, right? They're going from outside of your base of like communications control to into, right? And then once they're in, the hope is that they stay there and become an active participant in your organization's reach. But this communication is the first step in doing that and bringing them into your organization and into your base. And update and refine your work. The world changes and the stories change within it. I am sure all of us have seen a movie from the 90s or 80s and been like, oh boy, they could not air that today, right? The trends and things that were okay even 5 years ago for good reason are not okay today, right? So just because something's worked in the past doesn't mean you don't want to be caught, holding the bag and society has passed your language by, and then now you have a crisis because you weren't on top of updating how you've talked about things. So continually seek out improvement. Ask people from the communities that you're serving that, do you want to be described this way? Is this how you want to be shared, right? It's their story, so make sure that you're getting their input and their acceptance on how those stories are being shared. So you're staying relevant and you're staying effective. And distribute your stories widely. With social media now, there are so many different ways and formats of how you can share stories, which forms of storytelling are more engaging for which platform. And so they, based on the information and like what you're trying to get done through your storytelling, tailor those to the service or platform that you want to share them through. So whether it's video, audio, just written word, even the style between those different formats will change depending on who the audience is and where you're sharing that information. And that is that. I wanted to leave a little bit of space if we had any more follow-up questions, and also highlight that our next fundraising Friday will be on the 25th. So please join us for that. And if you have any questions, you can email either Polly, I, or Bethany, or Michelle. And here is our feedback survey. Would love some feedback from y'all. But yeah, we still have a couple minutes, so happy to answer some questions. If you have follow-ups, feel free to email us if we don't get to it.
I have two questions. One is, people talk about kind of doing this A/B testing where you tell one story to, half your audience and another story to the other half of your audience, and then you kind of measure the success of which one resonated more. But again, I'm like an office of one that I just don't really have the ability to do that or track that. I mean, I could, I guess, I could really hustle. And I guess the question is it worth trying it once and maybe at like a low stakes level thing? Or I just don't even know where to even start trying to do something like that. And then my other question is, we've had some changes in like the executive director. So, obviously every time a new executive director comes in, he or she has a different voice, right? And he or she may also not really be that well connected in the community, and his or her voice may be a little bit off. So it's hard as then the development director to kind of say like, that was a good crack at a letter, but I really don't think that's going to resonate well with our community. We need to make a few changes. You're hoping your executive director will concur, but sometimes they don't. And that's also puts you in an awkward situation. So just some food for thought for some conversations.
Sure.
That's such a huge one.
Polly, do you want to take a swing?
Yeah. So I have certainly had the experience where, and like you have a couple either, ED changes, and every time there wants to be like, they want to leave their fingerprints on the tone, just everything voice wise of the organization. And I would, this is one of those times where I get a little pushy and say like, like the organization, the voice belongs to the organization, not to the individual. Now, over time, their personality might start poking through, but it can't be an abrupt change. So I will always point to like corporate America and say, and point out like, you might see different marketing from McDonald's, but who McDonald's is as a brand has not changed. Nike has been using Just Do It for like 3 or more decades. There are things that you do have to hold sacred, for lack of a better word, in your organization, and that others need to sort of conform to. You don't have somebody rolling into McDonald's and being like, well, my favorite color is blue, so we're going to change the color of the arches. Like, that's just not going to be how they make decisions, right? So I try to impress upon like the need for, tone, message, delivery, all of that part of the messaging, changes to be done branding needs to be done in a very deliberate, inclusive way. If I don't win that argument, then I try to do it in the editing process, and like try to bring it back to the organizational tone in a different way, in the editing process. Sometimes you're just going to lose, and what you can do there is use data and just be like, hey, like if their stuff is better responded to, then you can just use that info and be like, all right, our past messages did this well, but this new way of talking actually is doing better. Let's see what we can learn from this. Maybe we try to, just watch it. As far as like not having the bandwidth to do testing, I get it. But you almost, it becomes a thing where like, if you don't start learning from it, then your assumptions could just drive you crazy, and drive your results down. It is not as scientific, but what one of the things that I will often do, especially like I've done a lot of consulting in my life. So if I'm new consulting, I'll take a look at a whole bunch of their communications campaigns and solicitations and otherwise, and look at like which ones did the best and compare them with the ones that did the worst and see what was different. Was it time of year? Was it length? Was it language? Was it, what can I learn from what we already know? And then I try to like use what I know. And then in my own testing, if it's email, the first thing that I would test is subject line, and not necessarily like the exact words, because you can't have the same subject line every time. But is it active voice, passive voice? Is it leading? Is it, like, is it a, like, I got one important thing to tell you today. And, the only way what the one thing is if you open the email, like, is it, like, try to, like, it might be something like that, because that's an easy one. It's an easy test and it doesn't take a lot of energy or time to be like, half is going to get this subject line, half is going to get this subject line, the rest is the same. So I do try to find ways to test one thing, test something that will help me learn to do a little better. And then, if like active voice worked better in that one test on the subject line, I might start using active voice and then just see if there's an upward trend, or was that an anomaly? I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you have any suggestions for that one, Kafili?
Yeah, I think for the A/B testing, I think, part of this is like just not letting, perfect be the enemy of like starting, right? We're all probably in like under-resourced or understaffed development shops. But these are tactics, right? So, just figure out, whether it's this or something else, just where to start on this journey of like getting better storytelling, right? As hopefully your organization grows and you have more capacity and space to do things, like you can add more to it. I think oftentimes we get this pressure of like, there's this new hot thing that everyone's doing. And so we have to do that one thing and like throw out all of our other tactics to like focus on building in this one new tactic. And that just doesn't work, especially if you're in a smaller shop. So I would just say I like snowball methods for everything. Whatever is the smallest change that can get you on this journey of like starting to think, critically about your storytelling, like whether it's just, even just going back and reading and just being like, this might have been too jargony, I want to change this language, right? Or anything like that, we'll just start getting that creative brain flowing. And then the next steps will automatically lead from that. I think that there are a lot of tactics that you can use. But what's most important is that you're just on a process of self-improvement for yourself and for your org.
Thank you.
Great. I know we're a little bit over, so I want to respect folks' time. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining again. Please, if you have additional questions, I know we didn't have too much Q&A time. Feel free to email either Polly or I, and hopefully we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Take care, y'all.